All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You guys sent in some really interesting stuff this week. This one in particular caught my eye. It's called Bodybuilding Made Simple. It's a PDF. And I thought, this would be really fun to sort of unpack together today.
Yeah, absolutely. That seems like a good one. Lots to dig into.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people out there, regardless of whether they're just getting started with working out, with, bodybuilding, or whether they've been doing it for a while. I think we can all learn a thing or two about kind of what really is important when it comes to putting on muscle, getting stronger, and really just kind of seeing those gains. So that's kind of our mission today.
Yeah, that's it. Cut through the noise. There's so much information out there, so much of it conflicting. And this guide, what I liked about it right away, it's about those core principles, the stuff that really matters. Whether you're a beginner or you've been hitting the weights for a while, we're going to be looking at training, of course, how to train effectively, diet, we all know how important that is, and recovery, which sometimes gets overlooked, and maybe debunk a few myths along the way.
Yeah, for sure. Bust some myths. I mean, everybody loves a good myth busting, right?
Always fun.
So this Bodybuilding Made Simple, it gets right to the point. And one of the things that kind of jumped out at me right away was this idea that less IS more. And they put it in all caps, less IS more, and it pops up a few times in this guide. So what do you think? What's the takeaway there?
Well, they're definitely challenging that traditional bodybuilding mentality that, more is always better. You got to spend hours in the gym to grow. This guide is saying, hold on, especially for natural lifters, guys who aren't, using anything to enhance their performance. For them, more than 55 minutes in the gym, well, it can actually be counterproductive after a point.
That's interesting, 55 minutes.
Yeah, and if you're hitting one muscle group a day, they even suggest like 35 minutes max. It's about really focusing on intensity and then getting out, letting your body recover.
Okay, that's kind of radical. 35 minutes. I mean, I feel like some people's warm-up routines are longer than that.
Right, but the idea here is about maximizing that hormonal response. When you're lifting naturally, your body has a certain window where it's primed for muscle growth. After that, it can shift, and you might actually start doing more harm than good by staying in the gym too long.
And, the guide does a really good job, I think, of kind of setting the stage early on about what are the key components here. It's not just about lifting weights. They break it down into three. They call it the three-legged stool of muscle growth. Exercise, diet, and sleep. You got to have all three.
Absolutely. You can't neglect any one of them. Think about it. When you lift, you're creating those tiny micro tears in your muscle fibers. That's the stimulus. But the actual growth, what we call hypertrophy, that happens when you're recovering, especially when you're sleeping. Your body repairs those tears, makes the muscle fibers bigger and stronger.
So it's like you're doing the damage in the gym, but the real magic happens when you're resting.
Exactly. And that's where diet comes in. You need the right nutrients, especially protein, to rebuild those muscles. And then sleep. 7 to 8 hours of good quality sleep is crucial. That's when your body releases growth hormone, which is like the repair crew, going in and fixing those muscles.
And it's not just about like crashing on the couch after a workout. It's specifically sleep, that deep, restful sleep.
Absolutely. And it's more about consistency than a specific bedtime. Some people are night owls, some are early birds. But if you're consistently getting those 7 to 8 hours, that's what matters. Your body can establish those rhythms, those circadian rhythms, and optimize that recovery process.
Makes sense. So we've got exercise, diet, sleep, all three working together. Now let's talk about actually hitting the gym. There's this obsession with the pump and the burn. You go to the gym, you see guys flexing in the mirror. Is that really a sign of a good workout, though?
Well, it feels good, right? And it can be motivating, but this guide throws some cold water on that. They're saying, look, the pump, that's just increased blood flow to the muscle. And the burn, that's lactic acid buildup. It means you're working hard, but it's not necessarily a direct indicator of muscle growth.
So if it's not about the pump and the burn, what should we be aiming for? How do we know if we're actually pushing ourselves hard enough?
They talk about this idea of complete exhaustion. At the end of a set, you genuinely feel like you can't do one more rep with good form. That's the point you're really stimulating those muscle fibers. Like, they give this example. You finish your chest workout, and you can't even bench press the empty bar. That's the level of fatigue we're talking about.
Okay, so it's not about feeling the burn. It's about pushing yourself to the point where you're done.
Pretty much. And of course, you have to be careful. You don't want to injure yourself, but that's the level of intensity they're talking about.
Another myth I've heard a lot is this idea of shaping your muscles.
Mhm.
Like you can do certain exercises to get that perfect bicep peak or whatever. This guide debunks that pretty quickly.
Yeah, they say that muscle shape is largely genetic. You're born with a certain bicep shape, and you can't really change that. You can make it bigger, you can make it smaller, but you can't fundamentally alter the shape. So those concentration curls might not be giving you that peak you're looking for if it's not in your genes.
So it's like you can't turn a square into a circle. You can just make the square bigger or smaller.
Exactly. So focus on building overall size and strength, and don't get too caught up in trying to sculpt specific shapes.
And then there's this belief that you need to like hammer each muscle group multiple times a week to see growth. This guide seems to disagree with that, right?
Yeah, they're back to that less IS more concept. They say that for natural lifters, giving your muscles adequate time to recover is more important than just hitting them over and over again. Remember, those micro tears need time to heal, and if you're constantly breaking them down without enough rest, you're actually hindering the growth process.
So it's like you're not actually growing in the gym, you're growing when you're resting.
Exactly. So don't be afraid to give your muscles a break. That's when the real magic happens.
Okay, now let's get into the nitty-gritty of designing your training. The guide talks about different rep ranges and what they're best for. So what's the breakdown?
All right, so they talk about 1 to 4 reps. That's primarily for strength development, like if you're into powerlifting. Then you've got 5 to 10 reps, which is the sweet spot for hypertrophy, for muscle growth. And anything above 10 reps, that's more for muscular endurance.
So if we're looking to pack on size, we should be focusing on that 5 to 10 rep range.
Exactly. But they specifically recommend spending most of your time in the 5 to 7 and 9 to 10 rep ranges. It's a good mix of strength and size building. And they suggest switching between these ranges every 4 weeks or so to keep those muscles guessing.
Why is it important to switch it up like that?
Your body is very adaptable. If you do the same thing over and over, it gets used to it, and your progress slows down. So by changing the rep ranges, you're introducing a new stimulus, and that keeps the muscles growing.
Makes sense. And then there's this idea of progressive overload, right? Like always trying to do a little bit more than last time.
Exactly. It's about constantly challenging yourself. Aim for 1 more rep each month, or even every week or two if you can. That's how you force those muscles to adapt and grow.
And the guide mentions that if you're not seeing that progress, if you're stuck at the same weight and reps, it could be a sign that something's off with your training or your diet.
Exactly. It's a good indicator to check in with yourself, see if you're pushing yourself hard enough in the gym, if you're recovering properly, and if you're fueling your body with the right nutrition.
So we've got rep ranges, progressive overload. What about exercise selection?
This guide is big on compound movements. Think squats, deadlifts, bench presses, exercises that work multiple muscle groups at the same time.
Yeah, I've always heard those are the best for overall muscle growth.
They're just more efficient. You're lifting heavier weights, recruiting more muscle fibers, and triggering a bigger hormonal response.
Okay, compound movements first. What about isolation exercises like bicep curls and tricep extensions?
They have their place. They can help you target specific muscles, but they shouldn't be the foundation of your training, especially if you're focused on overall mass.
So it's like build the foundation with the big compound movements, then maybe fine-tune with some isolation work.
Exactly. And the guide mentions 3 common workout routines: full body, 3 times a week, hitting 1 muscle group per day, and then combining primary and auxiliary muscles together.
Like chest and triceps or back and biceps.
Right. But they don't recommend that last one, combining primary and auxiliary muscles. They say it's hard to maintain intensity on both. If you're doing heavy chest work, your triceps are already going to be fatigued, so you won't be able to hit them as hard.
Gotcha. So either full body or 1 muscle group per day seems to be the way to go.
Yeah, and they also stress that there's no magic bullet. Stick to the basics. Squats, deadlifts, presses, rows. Those are the bread and butter of bodybuilding.
Okay, no need to chase after those fancy exercises with the complicated names.
Nope. Consistency and effort with the basics will get you much further than chasing trends.
All right, let's talk about food. This guide is adamant about the importance of diet, right?
Oh yeah, they hammer it home. They say you can't outtrain a bad diet. You can have the perfect workout routine, but if you're not fueling your body properly, you're not going to see the results you want.
So what are some of the common dietary mistakes people make?
The big ones are not eating enough calories overall, eating too much junk food, not getting enough protein, and not eating frequently enough.
Okay, so quality and quantity both matter.
Exactly. And they recommend eating 6 to 8 smaller meals throughout the day every 2 to 3 hours.
Why so often?
It's about optimizing nutrient absorption and keeping a steady supply of energy and amino acids flowing to your muscles. It can also help regulate your blood sugar and insulin levels.
Okay, makes sense. And they talk about bulking and cutting, right?
Yeah, bulking is when you intentionally eat more calories to gain weight, primarily muscle. And cutting is when you reduce your calorie intake to lose fat.
So bulking is for putting on size, cutting is for getting leaner.
Exactly. But they say your lifting routine should stay pretty much the same whether you're bulking, cutting, or maintaining.
Why is that?
Because weightlifting is the signal that tells your body to build muscle. So you want to keep that signal consistent. The main adjustments you'll make are to your diet and cardio.
Okay, so lifting stays the same, diet and cardio change depending on your goals.
Exactly. And for those who are cutting, the guide is very clear about one thing. There's no such thing as spot fat reduction. You can't target belly fat with crunches, for example. You lose fat from all over your body.
Yeah, that's a myth that just won't die.
It's true, though. Genetics largely determine where you lose fat from first.
And they also talk about the importance of staying hydrated.
Oh, yeah. Water is crucial for everything.
Yeah.
Muscle function, nutrient transport, recovery. They say even mild dehydration can really hurt your performance.
Okay, water is key. So we've got food, water. What about recovery?
This guide emphasizes that muscle growth actually happens during rest, not during your workouts.
We've touched on that a bit, but it's worth repeating.
Definitely. They recommend taking a full week off from training every 7 to 9 weeks to allow your body to fully recover.
Even if you feel like you could keep going.
Yeah, it's about preventing overtraining and giving your body a chance to reset. You'll come back stronger in the long run.
Okay, planned rest is important. What about rest between sets during a workout?
They recommend 2.5 to 3 minutes between sets. That's enough time to recover your strength and energy so you can maintain good form and intensity on the next set.
And they also talk about listening to your body, right? If you're feeling pain, stop.
Absolutely. Pushing through pain is a recipe for injury. There's a difference between muscle soreness and actual pain. If something hurts, stop and figure out what's going on.
Okay, good advice. Now, what about cardio? How does that fit into the bodybuilding picture?
They define cardio as any intense activity that raises your heart rate, and they advise limiting it to a maximum of 2 hours per week.
Even when you're cutting.
Yeah, the concern is that too much cardio, especially when you're also restricting calories, can lead to muscle loss.
So it's about finding that balance between burning fat and preserving muscle.
Exactly. And they recommend doing cardio after your weightlifting session.
What is that?
Because after lifting, your glycogen stores are depleted, so your body is more likely to tap into fat for fuel during your cardio.
Okay, that makes sense. And just like with lifting, warming up and cooling down are important for cardio too.
Absolutely. Prevents injuries and helps optimize your performance.
Right. Last but not least, let's talk about supplements.
This guide starts by saying that real food is the best supplement.
Can't argue with that.
And they also point out that the FDA doesn't regulate supplements as strictly as food and drugs. So buyer beware.
Do your research.
Exactly. They talk about protein bars, which can be a convenient way to get protein after a workout. Whey protein powder is another good option for post-workout recovery.
Yeah, those are pretty standard.
Creatine gets a bit more nuanced. They say it can increase strength and size, but mainly because it causes water retention in the muscles. So those gains might disappear when you stop taking it.
Interesting. So creatine might not be a permanent solution.
And they advise cycling it if you do use it. And they say liquid creatine is not effective.
Okay, good to know. What else?
Glutamine, they mentioned that.
Yeah.
It's an amino acid that might help with recovery and protein synthesis, but they're not big on liquid amino acid supplements in general.
And what about weight gainers?
They acknowledge they can be helpful for people who struggle to eat enough calories, but they say prioritize whole foods whenever possible.
Real food first.
Always. And then, of course, they strongly advise against steroids, prohormones, and synthol. They're dangerous and can have serious side effects.
Yeah, stay away from that stuff.
And the bottom line with any supplement is know what you're taking before you put it in your body.
Do your homework.
Absolutely.
All right, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here with this Bodybuilding Made Simple guide. It's pretty comprehensive, and it's got a lot of good information, especially for those who are new to bodybuilding.
Yeah, it's a good starting point. It lays out the fundamentals really well, the importance of training, diet, recovery, and it debunks some of those common myths that can hold people back.
That less IS, more philosophy is a good takeaway. It's a reminder that you don't need to spend hours in the gym to see results. Quality over quantity.
Exactly. Focus on the key principles. Be consistent with your efforts, and don't be afraid to experiment a little to find what works best for you.
And remember, what works for one person might not work for another. So listen to your body, adjust as needed, and keep learning.
Absolutely. This guide is a great starting point, but it's just the beginning of the journey.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Think about this less IS, more philosophy and how it might apply to other areas of your life. We tend to think that more is always better, but maybe sometimes focusing on quality over quantity can lead to better results.
It's an interesting idea. Maybe there are some muscle magazines in other areas of our lives that are leading us astray, telling us we need to do more when maybe we just need to do better.
Something to think about. Anyway, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Bodybuilding Made Simple. Until next time, keep lifting, keep learning, and keep questioning.
See you next time.